Previously on The Dark Side of Love, actress Dominique Dunne was riding high following her starring role in the 1982 box office smash, Poltergeist. However, her life was tragically cut short when her ex-boyfriend, Thomas Sweeney, strangles and kills her. And while John goes on trial for killing Dominique, for her friends and family, it feels like she's the one being judged, leaving everyone to wonder if justice is possible. Hello, and welcome to The Dark Side of Love. I am your host, Bianca Sloan, author of suspense novels about the dark side of love. And this week I'm putting a spotlight on part 2 of the case I'm calling A Case of Murder. In the final days of October 1982, as Dominique Dunne lay in a coma on life support with a bolt screwed into her head to relieve the pressure on her brain, after her ex-boyfriend Thomas Sweeney, a chef at the famed Ma Maison restaurant, violently and viciously strangled her, the LAPD are attempting to get his side of the story about what happened that horrible night. Because it was Halloween Eve, this is October 30th, 1982, John had brought over some pumpkins to Dominique's house, and he'd also carved a mask made out of chocolate to look like her. Dominique had been unmoved by the gifts and called John at work that night to tell him that their relationship was done. John then calmly walked the 2 miles from Ma Maison to her house in West Hollywood, determined to confront her. As People magazine put it, John's version, quote, one that made Dominique seem two-faced and heartless, the couple had been talking about getting back together, and that according to John, quote, she began to tell me that she didn't want to reconcile, that she had been lying about it. He claimed that they had talked about having a family and indicated that Dominique had been leading him on, making him believe that they had a future together, and that when she said they didn't, that he essentially snapped and lunged at her. John, who is over 6 feet tall, described by Deputy District Attorney Stephen Barshop in the True Hollywood story as, quote, a big guy with very big hands. He says that he has no memory of what happened, that he blacked out, and when he snapped back to the present, he found himself on top of the 5'1" Dominique, his hands wrapped around her neck. And then he said he realized that she wasn't breathing, and that he tried to get her to walk, like he picked her up and he was trying to get her to come to, but that she fell down. He said he tried to give her CPR, that she vomited, and that he vomited. At this point, John says he ran into the house and swallowed 2 bottles of pills because he didn't want to live anymore. He claims to have then laid down on the ground next to Dominique and reached inside her mouth to pull her tongue outside of her throat, which he says is something he used to do for his father when he would have epileptic seizures. This is quite a story. First of all, there weren't ever any pill bottles recovered from the scene, and no account that I could find of John being rushed to the hospital to have his stomach pumped, which 2 bottles of pills, you'd probably get rushed to the hospital to have your stomach pumped. And so then what pills exactly did he take? Were they Flintstones, vitamins? Secondly, when police took John into custody, he didn't strike them as being all that broken up about what had just happened with Dominique. With Detective Harold Johnston of the Los Angeles Homicide Bureau telling the True Hollywood story, quote, my first impression was that he was concerned with himself more than he was Miss Dunne. As People magazine noted, arresting officers found John, quote, calm and collected. On the way to the police station, he told a cop, quote, I effed up. I can't believe I did something that will put me behind bars forever. Man, I blew it. I killed her. I didn't think I choked her that hard. And to that point, investigators believed that John choked Dominique for up to 5 minutes. The medical examiner said that she was choked for 3 minutes. So Dominique Dunne was choked by Thomas Sweeney for anywhere between 3 to 5 minutes. People magazine went on to observe that, quote, in another investigator's opinion, Sweeney had plenty of time to regain control and let Dominique live. John was interrogated that first night for about an hour and a half. He refused to let investigators record what was going on, was worried that someone was listening outside the door. And when one of the detectives said something about how well Dominique's acting career was going, people reported that John's response was, quote, "Well, I was doing quite well in my career. I'm quite proud of what I've done." And it's interesting that he says that because according to what Dominique Dunne, the writer, and that's Dominique's father, what he wrote in Vanity Fair is that John's life is kind of a hot mess. He has no car. He doesn't even have a driver's license, which how do you get around LA without a car? And despite being a chef at Ma Maison, which at that point in time, 1982, was one of the hottest, most esteemed restaurants in the city, John is almost totally broke. Initially, John was charged with first-degree murder, and the public defender assigned to him, Paul Fitzgerald, tried for a plea bargain. Except Dominique's family, which again included her father, Dominique, and her brother, the actor Griffin Dunne, they had briefly considered it only because Ellen, that's Dominique's mother, had MS, multiple sclerosis. And the thought was that a protracted and no doubt trying murder trial would have an adverse effect on her health. Ellen said absolutely not, no deal, and so the family rejected that. They wanted a trial, they wanted a conviction for murder. In an article that he wrote for Vanity Fair about his daughter's murder and the subsequent trial, Dominique described being incensed by Patrick Terrell, that was John Sweeney's boss at Ma Maison, for telling the Los Angeles Times that his sous chef was, quote, "a very dependable young man," and that he planned to get John the best lawyers that money could buy. Further stoking Dominique's ire was that there had been no mention of Dominique in this same article, and Dominique said that, in fact, Patrick, who knew the Dunne family, never even reached out to them at all. No cards, no calls, no letters. Now, John was assigned another public defender by the name of Michael Adelson, and the legal counsel for Ma Maison, Joseph Shapiro, at Patrick Terrell's behest, assisted Michael Adelson on the defense. Dominique noted in his article that Joseph Shapiro, who was with the high-powered law firm of Donovan, Leisure, Newton, and Irvine, was, quote, "an ever-present but elusive figure following the night of the murder, right up until the day of the verdict." So while technically Patrick did not hire a lawyer for his sous chef, he did provide him legal counsel of sorts by having this Shapiro guy help the public defender. And I'm going to put a pin in this because this will come up later. Dominique shared in the Vanity Fair article that 2 days before jury selection began, Ellen had gotten a call from a journalist friend who had a message from John's public defender, Michael Adelson, which was to offer yet another plea bargain and to express that, quote, Sweeney was full of remorse and was willing to go to prison. He would plead guilty to a reduced charge of manslaughter, which carried a sentence of 7.5 years, and in exchange, he wanted an assault charge from before Dominique's murder to be scrubbed from his record. Dominique commented in the article that this journalist friend said, quote, Adelson saw this case not as a crime, but as a tragedy of a blue-collar kid who got mixed up in Beverly Hills society and couldn't handle it. The journalist, who I would love to know who this was because it just gives me all kinds of ick, went on to suggest that the prosecutor assigned to the case, Deputy District Attorney Stephen Barshaw, wasn't up to the task, and that John and Dominique's neighbors, so the couple had lived together in that house, they'd rented a house together in West Hollywood, the same place where John had strangled Dominique, that the couple's neighbors would be called to testify about the fights that the couple had, so I guess painting them as this volatile couple prone to knockdown dragouts. By this point, even if the family had wanted to accept the deal, they couldn't. It was out of their hands. The state of California was proceeding with its case against John Thomas Sweeney. The trial began in August of 1983 at the Santa Monica Courthouse, and as Jim McHugh, who is a photographer for People magazine, told TMZ Investigates, the trial garnered major attention for a number of reasons, saying, quote, this was kind of the beginning of that sort of big media. So high profile. The girl, the restaurant, the family. It just had all of these parts to it. And the judge assigned to this high-profile case was a man by the name of Burton S. Katz. Judge Katz spent 14 years as a deputy district attorney and had actually prosecuted some of the Z-list members of the Manson family. He was not well liked during his time in the DA's office, considered to be overly ambitious and starry-eyed over high-profile trials. This is how Dominic described him to Vanity Fair. Quote, "He was expensively barbered, deeply tanned, and noticeably dressed in a manner associated more with Hollywood agents than with superior court judges. He has tinted aviator glasses, and on the first day he was wearing designer jeans, glossy white loafers, and no necktie beneath his judicial robes. Every seat in the courthouse was filled, and Judge Katz seemed to like playing to the audience." Judge Katz is so concerned with playing to the audience with his image with the media in the courtroom. Jim McHugh, that's that People magazine photographer, he shared with True Hollywood Story and TMZ Investigates that at one point in the trial, Judge Katz had called him into his chambers, and Jim thought he was going to be warned about how to conduct himself in the courtroom, not to take pictures at the jury, so on and so forth. No. What Judge Katz was concerned about were the tinted glasses, those aviator sunglasses that he wore to court every day. He was concerned you wouldn't be able to see his eyes in any of the pictures, and he had a different pair at home. And, he could just send his bailiff to his house to get that pair if the photographer thought that worked better. And did he think that worked better? I mean, this is what he's concerned about in a murder trial. And this would be the first of all kinds of garbage nonsense to come from this judge, but we'll get to that in a minute. Even before the trial started, it was clear that John's defense attorney, Michael Adelson, has no shame. I mentioned earlier about him trying to, in my view, bully the Dunne family into accepting the plea bargain. Well, then he tried to bar Dominique's mother, Ellen, from attending the trial because she was in a wheelchair due to her MS. His argument was that the visual of the victim's mother in a wheelchair would create, quote, undue sympathy, and that her appearance would be prejudicial towards his client. This is Dominique's mother. Can you imagine attempting to banish her from the courtroom in the trial of her daughter's killer? Well, it didn't work, by the way, and Ellen attended every day of the trial. Another manipulation tactic was perpetrated in the form of the defendant himself. Every day, John walked into the courtroom dressed in all black, carrying a Bible, with Dominic noted that he was looking, quote, like a sacristan. The Bible was all for show, because not one time during the trial did John open it. He would just rest his hands on it, trying to look very demure, very mindful. Producer Charlie Wessler, who has known Dominique since she was a little girl, told TMZ Investigates that he found the whole thing with John carrying the Bible around to be so ludicrous that he was sure that the jury was going to see it for what it was and start laughing. Not so much. Jury foreman Paul Spiegel admitted to TMZ Investigates that seeing John clutching that Bible every day likely did have a little bit of an effect on him at the time, saying, quote, he was trying to present a certain demeanor, and I think it was done well. To add to this portrait of tortured choir boy, John cried constantly. Dominic shared in Vanity Fair that, quote, one day, the court had to be recessed because he claimed the other prisoners had been harassing him before he entered, and he needed time to cry in private. Give me a break. So clearly, Michael Adelson is playing this from all angles, and it seemed to be working. Griffin, Dominique's brother, he noted to TMZ Investigates that it was obvious Judge Katz did not care for the prosecutor, Stephen Barshaw, while Dominic observed in his Vanity Fair article that it was Michael Adelson who had won Judge Katz's favor, as he, quote, recognized Katz's enormous appetite for flattery and indulged it shamelessly. The two of them had running jokes, there were moondoggy glances at each other, the whole thing. They're in love, clearly. But there was another more serious issue that would have a seismic impact on the whole trial. So during the course of the police investigation into John Sweeney, according to Vanity Fair, which is the article that Dominic wrote for Vanity Fair, an informant from Ma Maison, it's the restaurant where John worked, had told Harold Johnston, that's the LAPD detective who had interrogated John the night of the murder, that During the time that John was training at a restaurant in France, there had been a girlfriend that he had committed at least one act of violence against. And then Johnston got a lead a little closer to home. He was given a tip from a Beverly Hills publicist by the name of Lynn Brennan that he should talk to one of John's ex-girlfriends, a woman by the name of Lillian Pierce. John and Lillian had dated off and on from 1977 to 1980. And like Dominique, Lillian was petite, dark-haired, and came from wealth. And like Dominique, John viciously and regularly physically abused her. 10 different times during the course of their off-and-on relationship, John beat Lillian. He broke her nose, punctured her eardrum, threw rocks at her, collapsed her lung. He pushed her down the stairs. He smashed pictures and furniture, which is something Dominique had described to her mother that John had done to her. Lillian was hospitalized twice as a result of John's brutality. This shows an unmistakable pattern of rage and violence, and that John Sweeney likes to beat up women. Lillian was subpoenaed by the prosecution to testify, and Michael Adelson asked that her testimony be given outside of the presence of the jury, supposedly so that the judge could determine if it was relevant to the case. I mean, it seems pretty relevant. However, the judge agreed, and with this jury sequestered elsewhere, Lillian Pierce gave harrowing testimony about the sadism that she suffered at the hands of John Sweeney. Dominic noted in his article that during her testimony, Lillian never looked at John, who refused to look at her, and that you could pretty much hear a pin drop in the courtroom as she spoke. Dominic said that Adelson was livid about the effect that Lillian's words were having, and he came after her like a pit bull, asking her things like, "Were you not drunk? Were you not drugged?" Every dirty trick that Michael Adelson tried against Lillian Pierce failed, as he was unable to shake her composure. She was a thoroughly compelling witness. Dominic said in Vanity Fair that the family later learned that Lillian sat in her car outside the church where Dominic's funeral was being held and cried, too overwhelmed with guilt to go inside. When it was Stephen Barshop's turn to question Lillian, he asked if she came from a well-to-do family. And after Michael Adelson objected, Stephen told the judge that he was attempting to establish a pattern. As Dominic described in Vanity Fair, John absolutely lost his shiz when this happened. Jumped out of his seat, the prop Bible goes flying out of his hands into the air, and he bolted for the judge's chambers. Lillian, she was still on the stand testifying, and she let out a little yelp. The bailiff lunged for John, grabbing him, followed in quick succession by 4 armed guards rushing into the courtroom for an assist, nearly toppling over Ellen's wheelchair. John and the bailiff crashed into a filing cabinet, and the defendant was wrestled to the floor before being handcuffed to the arms of his chair. His attorney commanded him to get it together. It was an insane, utterly unbelievable moment. John sobbed like a baby and apologized to the court, claiming that he was not trying to escape. Now, typically, an outburst like this in open court would be completely 100% unacceptable and would result in some sort of a punishment from the judge, such as being held in contempt or even being removed from the courtroom altogether. Well, the Honorable Burton S. Katz has no such inclination towards John Thomas Sweeney. No, instead of doing any of those things, even issuing a warning, Judge Katz accepts his apology and says, quote, "We know what a strain you are under, Mr. Sweeney. We know what a strain you are under. What in the actual F is going on?" As LAPD Detective Harold Johnston said in the E! True Hollywood story about the incident, quote, "He was only mildly censured by the judge for this conduct, which was surprising to everyone. That if a person attempts to run from the courtroom, sometimes judges get unhappy about that. For some reason, Judge Katz was not unhappy." For his part, Dominic stated in Vanity Fair, quote, "I was appalled at the lack of severity of the judge's admonishment. What we had witnessed had nothing to do with escape. It was an explosion of anger. It showed us how little it took to incite John Sweeney to active rage." And remember, the jury saw none of this. They had no idea that any of this had happened. And remember that because it'll become important later. And ultimately, in what would prove to be a true tipping point for the trial, as in tip the whole thing over the cliff, Judge Katz rules that Lillian's emotional testimony, which again clearly shows an obvious pattern of violence from John Sweeney, he dismisses it as inadmissible, as prejudicial, as having no bearing on the case. The jury would never know Lillian Pierce's name. Judge Katz would later admit in the E! True Hollywood Story that Lillian's testimony would have been powerful, but then he hid behind some legalese about the Supreme Court wouldn't let him do it or some such garbage nonsense. But prosecutor Stephen Barshop was much more blunt in his assessment, telling the program, quote, "I thought it killed the case. The jury doesn't get to know the facts. When the facts aren't known to the jury, they decide the case in a vacuum." After John's outburst, he seemed pretty docile for the remainder of the trial, and Dominic observed in Vanity Fair that he suspected John was sedated. Stephen Barshop, he suspected the same thing, and he requested a urine or blood test on the defendant, which, of course, Judge Katz denied the request. Just another in a long line of really effed up things that Judge Katz would do while presiding over this trial. Dominic observed in Vanity Fair that Judge Katz's interactions with the jury, quote, bordered on the flirtatious, and they responded in kind. If the court was called for 10, Judge Katz invariably began around 11, with elaborate and charming apologies to the jury. One Monday morning, he told them he had had a great weekend in Ensenada, that he'd had the top down on his car both ways, and that he wished they had been there with him. The ladies laughed delightedly, and the men grinned back at him. And when the judge wasn't flirting with the jury, he would repeatedly mispronounce Dominique's name, calling her by her father's name, Dominic. Ellen told KNBC about Judge Katz, quote, "Never a word did he show towards us of sympathy of any kind." At the outset of the trial, the judge had threatened to have the entire Dunne family removed from the courtroom if they talked among themselves or made any noise of any kind, but would say to John, "I know how hard this is for you, Mr. Sweeney." Judge Katz would also rule that Ellen's eventual testimony, in which she described an incident where John ripped out tufts of Dominique's hair by the root, also inadmissible. And the hits just kept coming. Testimony from Dominique's friends, her agent, other actors, about incidents of violence that they had witnessed, other times that John had strangled Dominique or hit her, threw her to the ground, ruled as hearsay, tossed out. In an effort to blunt the damage that Judge Katz was doing to the case, Stephen Barshop had a few tricks up his sleeve. To demonstrate to the jury how long John had his hands wrapped around Dominique's throat, 3 to 5 minutes by the medical examiner's estimation, Stephen held up a watch with a second hand and let it run for an excruciating 4 minutes, saying to the jury, "Ladies and gentlemen, I am going to show you how long it took for Dominique Dunne to die." Dominic wrote, quote, "For 4 minutes, the courtroom sat in hushed silence. It was horrifying. I had never allowed myself to think how long she had struggled in his hands, thrashing for her life." Stephen said in the E! True Hollywood Story, quote, "The nature of this killing was a strangulation. You have to be up close and personal. You have to take your hands and wrap them around somebody's throat and strangle the person, cut off his windpipe, and assert enough pressure that this person dies in your hands." Stephen Barshop rested his case, and as Michael Adelson prepared to present his defense of John Sweeney, Judge Katz dropped yet another bombshell onto the proceedings. So as I mentioned earlier, John had been charged with murder 1, which is the intentional killing of someone and usually results in the harshest punishment. While Michael Adelson had asked the court to only allow the jury to consider murder 2, which is murder with malicious intent, though not premeditated, or manslaughter, which is not intentional, what the law considers to be an act committed in the heat of passion. Adelson's argument was that there wasn't any premeditation or deliberation, and he told E! True Hollywood Story that his client suffered from, quote, "a rage engendered by this relationship, a classic case of manslaughter." Prosecutors said that it should be up to the jury to decide whether or not when John had killed Dominique if it was premeditated or deliberate. he was incredulous that the defense would try to argue a heat of passion defense, telling E! True Hollywood Story, quote, "How can somebody be in a heat of passion when the person has a history in relation to domestic violence?" Excellent question. Charlie Wessler didn't buy for 1 second that John Sweeney just snapped and killed Dominique, noting that it took John a little over a half hour to walk from Montmaison to Dominique's house that night, which gave him plenty of time to think. Charlie said to TMZ Investigates, quote, "He had 35 minutes to understand he was about to murder somebody. There's no doubt in my mind that he knew that he was going to kill her. His history was, I like to beat up women, particularly women that are small and easy to kill, easy to hospitalize. And this is what his real goal was." Actress Gloria Gifford, who was friends with Dominique, concurred with this, telling TMZ Investigates about John, quote, "He just wanted to snuff her out, and he accomplished it." Well, of course, Judge Katz made the unfortunate decision to grant Michael Adelson's request. Murder 1 was out, and now murder 2 or manslaughter were the only 2 considerations on the table for the jury. In rationalizing his ruling, Judge Katz said John didn't bring a murder weapon to the house with him, which were her hands, and that because he didn't try to escape when cops arrived, therefore, he wasn't acting like a guilty man. I mean, he's guilty. He admitted it that night that he did it. That's not in dispute. Not helping matters was the testimony of actor David Packer, who was Dominique's co-star in the miniseries V for Visitors. So David was there that night that John killed Dominique. Dominique and David Packer were running lines that night. David did not physically intervene. Instead, he hid in the house while John and Dominique argued outside. He did eventually call the police, who kind of blew him off and said, this isn't even our jurisdiction, but you know what? Why don't you go outside, be a man, help Dominique, which he did not do. Anyway, David Packer eventually did go outside when it was too late, and he testified that from what he saw, it seemed like John might have been trying to resuscitate Dominique, which lends credence to the defense that John didn't mean it. I don't buy this, and I don't think anyone within the sound of my voice does either. It was dark, David Packer was far away, and let's be clear, John Sweeney was in a full-on rage that night. He was not trying to resuscitate her. As Charlie Wessler said, he knew what he was going there to do that night. No question in my mind about that. And speaking of Charlie Wessler, he said in the E! True Hollywood Story, this is a guy who took his hands, his big giant hands, put them around this teeny, fragile girl's neck and squeezed as hard as he could for 3 minutes. And I just defy you to take your watch and squeeze your wrist as hard as you can and watch your second hand go by for 3 minutes. And then you tell me that's heat of passion. That's not heat of passion. That's, I'm killing you. So Michael Adelson puts John on the stand, which if you have ever listened to an episode of this show, I always say, unless you're truly not guilty, or if it was self-defense, something like that, do not ever testify in your own defense. Dominic described in Vanity Fair John's demeanor on the stand as, quote, abjectly courteous, addressing the lawyers and judge as sir. He spoke very quietly and often had to be told to raise his voice so that the jurors could hear. Although he wept, he never once became flustered, and there was no sign of the rage he exhibited on the day Lillian Pierce took the stand. John downplayed the violent nature of his relationship with Dominique, explaining away one incident from about 5 weeks before she was killed, where he choked her, and she later climbed out of the window to get away from him, that he was merely trying to keep her from leaving the house. Gentleman that he was. Adelson, the attorney, he painted Dominique as a heavy drinker, or as Dominic noted in Vanity Fair as, quote, an out-on-the-town drunkard. He said she was a cokehead, that she'd had multiple abortions during the time they were together. I mean, it's like throwing spaghetti against the wall. Let's just see what we can get to stick. John also claimed that Dominique had promised him they would get back together, and that when she did an about-face that night with People magazine, reporting that according to him, he asked her, quote, what about our daily discussions of children and getting married? Was that all lies? You mean all this time you've been leading me on? And according to John, Dominique said, yes, I have been lying to you. And that in response, he just, quote, exploded and lunged towards her. So he basically made it seem as though Dominique was stringing him along, jerking him around. So Adelson declared that he felt the jury really needed to get a full sense of the dynamics of the relationship between Dominique and John, the one who's still alive, saying in the E! True Hollywood Story, quote, I fully expected to put Sweeney on the witness stand and explain what his relationship with Dominique Dunne was, because it was only by explaining that relationship that the jury could come to understand why he might have been so enraged by what was being done and said on the date she met her demise at his hands. Stephen Barshop, the prosecutor, hit back at Adelson's characterization of John and Dominique's relationship, saying in the E! True Hollywood Story, quote, is John Sweeney this forlorn lover as portrayed by Adelson, or is he this abusive person that beats up women, that attacks women, that strangles women, that forces lungs to collapse and breaks noses? No, Sweeney, this isn't heat of passion. This is what you do. You beat up women. Sadly, the poor, pitiful, dejected, rejected, and hurt boyfriend, that act did in fact resonate with the jury, who, remember, they don't know about John's history of violence. They don't know what he did to Lillian Pierce. All they know is that he cried multiple times during his testimony and that he came across as being remorseful, or as Stephen Barshop said in E! True Hollywood Story, as being the, quote, poor lovesick puppy. Judge Katz would claim to the program that he didn't buy John's act, saying, quote, it didn't fool me, it didn't fool Dominique Dunne, it didn't fool Barshop, because, here he is clinging to his Bible and he's very passive and he looks like he's in pain and everything else. Sure, Jan, sure you didn't believe it. Yeah, you believed it. You believed every single word of it. Jury foreman Paul Spiegel said in E! True Hollywood Story, quote, there were some people in the jury room who felt, well, no wonder this guy was so confused and so distraught, because here he was made to go back and forth. I love you. No, I don't. We're going to get back together. No, we're not. Well, maybe. Now, absolutely not. At which point the guy flipped and the talk was, well, anybody would be distraught, would be hurt, would be shattered. Yeah, pathetic. I'm sorry. Pathetic. Fellow juror Mike Raymond seemed to echo that John's tortured demeanor in court had an impact. Telling TMZ Investigates, he cried a lot. He looked sad all the time. He was being remorseful, and that maybe this was a one-off thing. We all tend to go crazy once or twice in our lives. John claimed that the arguments with Dominique only happened after she had been drinking, which Dominique was not known to be a drinker, but blame the victim, drag out all of her dirty laundry, and if there isn't any, make some up, but protect John Sweeney's past at any and all costs, even at Dominique's expense. As Ellen said in an interview with KNBC Los Angeles, quote, it was as if our daughter were on trial. Dominique likened the slander against his daughter as her being murdered all over again, saying, quote, John Sweeney, who claimed to love Dominique and whose defense was that this was a crime of passion, slandered her in court as viciously and cruelly as he had strangled her. He went on to say about John, his violent past remained sacrosanct and inviolate, but her name was allowed to be trampled upon and kicked, with unsubstantiated charges by the man who killed her. Dominique also shared that they would later learn from one of John's fellow inmates that John had confessed to him that he was pretty sure that he had convinced police that he had not intended to kill Dominique, because remember, he said he didn't have any memory of attacking her. And John even apparently asked this guy, have you ever been with a girl who thought she was better than you? And another inmate said that John claimed that he said, quote, Dominique was a snob, too ambitious, who deserved what she got. Gosh, that sounds like a really remorseful person, doesn't it? When the time came for closing arguments, Stephen Barshop asked the jury to consider murder 2, since good old Judge Katz had snatched murder 1 off the table. And speaking of Judge Katz, Dominique noted that he was not even paying attention to the prosecution's closing statements, but that he, of course, gave his co-counsel, Michael Adelson, his full and undivided attention during his closing arguments. And the theme that Judge Katz's co-counsel hammered over and over and over again during his closing arguments was that John Sweeney was, quote, an ordinarily reasonable person. He said this during the course of the trial like it was a mantra. Dominic confessed to having lost how many times he heard that phrase, an ordinarily reasonable person. Adelson insists to the jury, quote, this was not a crime. This was a tragedy. He waxed poetic about that old-fashioned thing, romantic love, and he put words in Dominique's mouth about how I, quote, Dominique, reject you, Sweeney. I lied to you, Sweeney. Absolutely pathetic and seriously gross. Dominic was so disgusted that when court recessed and he passed by Michael Adelson, he whispered to him that he was a piece of shit. Right on, Dominic. So when the jury is handed the case for deliberation, their primary struggle during those deliberations was trying to understand the convoluted 120-page jury instructions that Judge Katz had stuck them with. The central question they kept coming back to was, would an ordinarily reasonable man under certain circumstances be moved to act in a similar way? According to what juror Mike Raymond told E! True Hollywood Story, another hang-up was struggling to define the intent to kill, or basically the difference between manslaughter and murder too. They repeatedly asked the judge to clarify his instructions to help them better define the difference between manslaughter and murder too, and each time he just kind of held up his hands and said, not my monkey, not my circus, read them again. The jury foreman would later say in TV interviews that the instructions were incomprehensible. Finally, after 8 days, there was a verdict. Next week on Part 3, the verdict is in. Will justice prevail? Here's a hint. Don't count on it. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, and show your love for The Dark Side of Love by visiting thedarksideoflove.com for show notes and transcripts. While you're there, sign up for my newsletter to be notified about new episodes. And you can also find a link to my Patreon page where you can access bonus material and other fun stuff. Learn more about my suspense novels about the dark side of love by visiting biancasloan.com. Thanks for hanging out with me, and join me next time for another tale of love gone wrong. I'll see you on the dark side.